So, good morning. I've got a question. Who knows where this is? Nobody? I know there's at least somebody in the audience hiding who has heard the answer to this question before, but I think he forgot. Yeah, Anton forgot. Okay. Typically, when I ask this question, people shout, Gent! It's not in Ghent. This is the marble room in the Antwerp Zoo, where in April 2009, Patrick Dubois and I got the crazy idea to organize a small conference to invite like 70 of our best friends talking about development and operations and bringing them together. And it's basically where we had the idea to start Devops Days. And that's how this whole movement started. We did a small thing in Gent, 70 people. The format of the conference was we had formal talks like what's happening here today in the morning. And in the afternoon, we had open spaces. And the open space concept where people share their experiences, talk about their problems, and discuss amongst their peers, that is actually what made the conference really popular. A bunch of people that were in Ghent took the idea back home. They took it back to the States. They took it back to Australia, actually to Brazil also. And then the year after, we ran a similar event in Hamburg. And we kept on doing the same. We toured in Europe the first couple of years, Göteborg, Rome, and then things started exploding. 2013 was the year where we had Amsterdam, Paris, 2 times in London, and a couple of things. Right before the pandemic, we celebrated the 10th year anniversary of Devops in Ghent. We had people from all over the world, and it was really painful to see how things evolved. If you look at where we started ages ago, it was a group of people who had solid experience in using open source technology at scale, contributing to open source projects, and working with those things. They were also practicing a lot of the Agile principles, and they were dabbling their feet into the first cloudy style of things. And if you look at the joint of those 3 things, that is where DevOps started. And I think even the biggest part of that was the fact that it was based on an open source movement, and it still is a large open source style community. So who can define DevOps for me? Okay, who's awake? Raise your hand if you're awake. Okay, half of the audience is awake. Okay, probably something to do with the low coffee here. So lessons learned, they're probably going to need to have coffee earlier tomorrow, because otherwise the rest of the audience is going to sleep. Okay, I admit defining DevOps is something which is really, really hard, even with coffee. So let me start with putting up a slide I used with Patrick, the date is still on there. 12 years ago, we spoke at Devops, and we defined DevOps as a global movement to improve the quality of software delivery, leveraging our open source experiences back in Ghent in 2009. And as you can see, the conference back then was around this time, a bit after Halloween, and we had a werewolves and vampires team. So the slides were a bit bloody, but it still shows the state of what DevOps is today. It's not a shiny, happy news. Not everything is perfect. When I read Tom Lyman-Selly's blog post this morning about Lisa basically isn't needed anymore because everybody is doing automation and everybody is happily working together and having CI in place, I was like, maybe in your part of the world or in your little silo, but what I'm seeing out there is still that there's way too much manual stuff being done, and people are still not testing what they put in production. So we still have to do this. We still have to teach people on how to do software delivery better. And if you look at what Devops Days did, 10 years ago we started. At the peak in 2019, we had 75 to 80 events a year. That's not including the events like this one, who are also talking about what's happening in this community. So this is a really growing community. This is a really huge community. If there's at least 1,000 people organizing events like this, then what about the practitioners? So who am I? I'm Kris. In the late 90s, I used to be a Java developer, PHP developer a bit later. I also did Perl and lots of other languages, even did Pro C. And at some point, I was the only one who knew how to rack a Spark into a rack and cluster it. So I became an operations person. My day job is helping people to deliver software. Inuits is one of the larger open source consultancies in Europe. We're about 150 people in Europe. We just spun off Ollie, which is a Prometheus consultancy. We're helping you with Prometheus and everything around it. And I did co-found Devops Days. Next to Devops Days, I also co-founded Config Management Camp, which is happening again in February in Gent. But what I'm mostly being cursed at is the title of my blog. Because people point at me when they figure out they run into another DNS problem. So why am I talking about this? Well, I think we need to look back at history. We need to look why we started the movement, or we didn't really want to start it, but why we caused these things to happen, and we need people to learn from these mistakes, because we keep making them over and over again. It says the old days. Because for lots of environments, this is still current business. For me, the story was when I was working at a large telco, and I was sitting in the engineering team, and suddenly marketing shows up and says, hey, we need to have this new website live. OK, so here's the tarball. Some external party developed this. Yeah, but we don't have servers for this. I mean, keep in mind, this is mid-2000, a bit earlier, well, probably even earlier, beginning of 2000. We don't have servers for this. Do you need a database? How about security? Do you want this to be high available? How many users do you expect? And we're like, well, there's a radio commercial at 5. Just make it happen on a Friday afternoon. Who's had this experience? I see some, who's had this year? And we didn't like it. We were like, we can do better. We don't want some developers to just throw something over the wall and then have to deal with it. So looking at how things have evolved, for me, is looking at the topics that Devops Days has in the open spaces. And if you've ever been to a Devops Day, you see the patterns. I can predict that at one of the future Devops Days this year, somebody is going to have an open space about power naps. Not kidding, it happened twice already this year. Somebody wants to organize an open space about monitoring and metrics. And you see those things evolve. So let's have a look at how we started doing this. In the early years, when we were talking about culture, which is obviously the biggest part of what DevOps is about, we were looking at a number of unicorn startups that were the poster child of our movement, that were the people we were looking after them. It's like, yes, that's how we want to work. There were success stories on people telling us how they achieved much faster and much more stable deployments. And we were talking about how to adopt things like Lean and Agile and Kanban. And if you see those same topics pop up in the talks right now, you see people saying, Agile doesn't work. We see large enterprises who come and talk about like the really, really small team that's really agile and forget about the rest of their organization. And we've even reached the point where people on stage can actively talk about anti-patterns, things that we know that won't work. And then 6 months later, they have to admit that, oh, well, it didn't really work for them. Way too many events have topics like burnout and mental health, because there's something still really wrong in this industry. So we went from the good news show to, hey, this is how we do things, to lots of people being frustrated and burned out and not having seen real solutions. When we talk about technology, we went from discussing tools, we went from early adopting tools like Steve Engine and Puppet and Chef, and later things like Ansible and Terraform. We were talking about how to do orchestration. I mean, this is 2011, we were talking orchestration across large clouds. We were talking about CI tools, how to really do deployments. And if you look at the topics right now, it's people, I mean, we jokingly call the second day of config management camp YAML camp, because that's what we become. We've all become YAML engineers. And who likes YAML? There's one person here who had coffee. So all the variety we had into being able to choose what kind of tools we used and to say, hey, we want to use different things and learn from each other. We're slowly getting to a monoculture. And not everything is as code yet. Definitely not. When we were talking about continuous deployment, continuous delivery, continuous integration, back then it was about teaching people, even system engineers, that they needed to adopt version control. That, well, back then we were still thinking that Git flow was a real thing, and that it was something that could help you. And we were teaching people out release management and things like that. Right now, today, we still need to teach people how to use Git, how to do version control. But now we have a different caveat. We need to let them unlearn all the mistakes they made. Long-running branches, merge hell, all of those things, like stop branching, do trunk-based development. If you look back at the early definitions of continuous integration, there's no long-running branches there. Those are the anti-patterns. And we see now that for lots of organizations, CI/CD means continuous disintegration and continuous destruction. If we look at DevOps, some people describe it as the CAMS movement: culture, automation, monitoring, measurement, and sharing security. So monitoring and metrics is obviously something that we really care about. We did a study early on, which we presented at Ottawa Linux Symposium in 2007, 2008. And when we looked at the state of open source monitoring tools back then, it was mostly, there were two. It was an Agile, and everybody hated it because it was hard to configure. There was bloated commercial stuff, which we ignored, we still do. And then there were a bunch of tools that were allowing us to do metrics and things like that, but they were really, really hard to set up, or they didn't scale at all. And I think it was 2011, 2012, when John Vincent loses on Twitter said monitoring sucks, and the monitoring sucks hashtag started to become really popular. Because we were frustrated as an industry with the state of open source and the state of tooling. And then change started happening. Now we have an ecosystem where we have much more mature monitoring tools. We have things like, well, it used to be Graphite, now we have tons of time series backends like Cortex and Tanos and all of those things. We have Prometheus if we have scalable ecosystems. And we moved from hating monitoring to loving monitoring. Ulf Manson gave a talk at Devops Days Rome in 2012 where he talked about his newfound love for monitoring. And he had his kids actually draw his slides, and it were happy hearts. But his newfound love was not about the tools. Well, it was partly about the tool he started liking, but it was mostly about the fact that he was automating his things. And he didn't have inconsistent states anymore between what was supposed to be running and what the system thought was running. He was automating his monitoring to a point where it was built in, and it was part of a thing rather than something that happens afterwards. And now we're talking much more about things like tracing and the 3 pillars of observability. But lots of organizations are still not there yet. They still need to get to the point where they fix their alert fatigue. So while some people in the industry are looking at how do they do tracing, how they really do much more advanced things than just monitoring, how they really go to observability, the massive amount of the industry is still not there yet. So it's still not good. Clouds. In the early days, we were talking about virtualization technologies, how to fast deploy things large at scale. We were talking about doing things which are really resilient and using the tools that were available to do so. We were talking about storage and distributed file systems because if we were doing things at scale, we needed to have fast and stable access to our data. And we were talking about open source implementations on how to achieve those things anywhere. How many of these tools are still around? OpenStack is still alive, the rest is disappeared. What are we talking about now? Well, not now, but 6, 7 years ago, things started. People are just starting to talk about Docker, Docker, Docker. We moved from giving developers a Vagrant box that allowed them to spin up a production-like environment and develop in there to just Docker, Docker, Docker. And it didn't help. If you look at most ecosystems now, they don't have a distributed file system they can trust. They store their files on NFS. NFS is a file system we tried to abandon in the early 2000s. I still remember Olaf Kjær giving a talk at LinuxConf with, on every slide of the titles, he had the explanation of what NFS stood for. Some of them I still remember. No file system, need for speed, network failure system. Those were not the kind of tools we wanted to depend on. But still, today, here we are. Most Kubernetes ecosystems I know, they just store their files on NFS. And we tolerate this. So yeah, Docker is really the tool that helped us forward in dividing the gap between developers and operations people. Because now we give people a container they can build locally, they can run locally, and then it's an ops problem. How do you network it? How do you secure it? Who's responsible for the container afterwards? So there's tooling hype, where at some point people even branded Docker the ultimate DevOps tool. And people jumping on those tools like, hey, we really need to use these tools, because otherwise we're not doing the DevOps thing. It really didn't help us. So we learned from this, right? I was really happy when, beginning of the year, people started to talk at conferences again that, well, even Google was talking at DevOps Days Prague, like, maybe you do not need Kubernetes. Maybe this is not something which is fit for you. I mean, I love it. It's a really great piece of technology, if you need it. But most organizations have absolutely no use. Or they fail to adapt their infrastructure, and they fail to adapt their application so they can benefit from it. The old lift and shifting. We're going to put it in the cloud, we're going to put it in Kubernetes now. And the end result being not so nice. If you architect for Kube, awesome. If you don't, maybe rethink. Like, cargo culting is real. People jump onto something looking at, oh, Google is doing this. We should, maybe not. This is what's happening. People go to conferences, they hear about a new fancy tool. This is going to solve their problem. And then they fail to change how they actually use it. We're going to go to the cloud. Here's a 5-paper form you need to fill in, and then somebody in IT will spin up a VM. But we're on Amazon now. And they're going to fail, and they're going to say, this doesn't work. Observability. I mean, we're doing a lot of Prometheus work, and the number of times people come to us and say, hey, we want Prometheus because our monitoring is broken. It's not broken because you're using a Kinga. It's broken because you're manually configuring it, and you're not fixing the problems you have. Yeah, we can switch you to Prometheus, we'll help you, but it's not going to fix the fact that if you don't have a single source of truth and you let people manually configure it, which is obviously with Prometheus a bit harder, it's still going to be painful because you need to make sure that it's completely automated. You need that single source of truth. But people just, nah, I want the UI in front of it, I want some people to be able to add services to it to configure it. It's not going to work. You're not going to fix the problem. So what I learned over the past decade is that this industry is really good at killing awesome things. And we keep doing it. Who likes ITIL? Most of us don't. Who's actually read the books? So ITIL today is perceived as the people who sit on a Friday morning at 10 a.m. in a meeting saying, no, we're not going to do this. And sometimes they have valid reasons for not wanting to do this. Okay, agreed. Mostly they don't because they have totally no idea what's happening. But the idea behind it is to reduce the risk. Continuous delivery, the idea about doing frequent, small incremental changes is to reduce the risk. The idea of collaborating and testing and doing all the automation we do is to reduce the risk. The thing we did, however, is we moved from 10 people in a room with no clue on a Friday morning to let a CI say, yes, this is going to fail, this is successful. And we automated that, and we improved that. And while those people might have the same ideas and the same concepts, their language was different. So if you take a number of the concepts from what's in the libraries and you automate them 1,000 times, you probably end up having what you want to have. Sadly, there's also a bunch of people who just looked at this as a rigid set of rules which you had to follow without understanding them. And that's when problems start happening. Agile is dead. For a lot of people, Agile is dead. And why is that? Because they've never seen Agile. They started out doing waterfall, 9-month projects, we'll deliver something in 9 months, and they figured out, well, this isn't going to work, we're going to deliver something in 6 months, but during those 6 months, you're going to do stand-ups and sprints, and you get Jira. Yay. And they called that scaled Agile. I mean, Martin Fowler has the explanation what STAVE stands for. It stands for Shitty Agile for Enterprises. I still think it is the best waterfall methodology out there. So if you, as a large corporate, are using SAFe, it's probably better than what you had before, but it's not Agile. So people say Agile is dead, but they've never seen it. So who killed DevOps? We did. I mean, I'm responsible partly for doing this. The first years of DevOps, I talked to pretty every conference that asked me about a talk, and the talk was titled 7 Tools for Your DevOps Stack. I think it was Vagrant, Puppet, Graphite, I don't even remember. I do remember the 7th one. And the 7th one was the human being. It was you. It was people collaborating and talking to each other. The problem is that most people went home and just implemented the 6 other ones and failed to understand that it was about the people. I did a rebound on that, and it was another 7 tools for your DevOps stack, and people still didn't get it. We also were talking to people and saying, hey, the discussions about Puppet versus Chef versus Ansible, which tool should you use? And the only answer lots of it had was yes. No, which one? No, yes, use a tool. Stop discussing which tool, figure out which tool your friends use, learn from that tool, and automate. And then when you improve, you'll figure out the finesses between which tool is better suited for what, but stop discussing, start using it. And then there's people who implemented all the tools. Like, okay, that's not gonna work. And then there was Docker, obviously. Who's a DevOps engineer? Again, one person had coffee, the rest is sleeping. DevOps is not a job title. It never has been, it never will be, unless your organization fails to understand what DevOps is about. I mean, what is a DevOps engineer? Is that a Java developer who runs production? Is that somebody who is in charge of the CI tools? Is that somebody, is that an ops person, but who's also fixing bugs in production? Oh no, that's a service restart engineer. Oh, that's SRE for those who didn't get it. Ken Mugridge found a job advert for a DevOps engineer, and it was somewhere you don't want to live probably, but they were paying zero salary. I mean, that was a recruiter that got it. He realized it was not a job. So what happens if you have a company that is hiring DevOps engineers? They put them in a DevOps team. So on one side, you have the developers. On the other side, you had the operations people. And we were not happy with people just throwing things over the wall. We just put another wall. We just put another silo in between. Oh, there's also a release management silo. There's a bunch of tooling silos. And the whole idea was to break down the silos and to get cross-functional teams that could take ownership. So by introducing a DevOps team, you kind of went the other way. I did a large project ages ago with a large big bank in the Netherlands. And when I arrived there, they said, well, we're going to do this DevOps thingy. We just created 250 DevOps teams. Like, okay. And what they did, they were actually merging their development and their operations teams and putting both managers on top of one team. Yeah, it had some struggles. So we kill things, and we kill things because we don't know, we don't realize it. But one thing that I learned is that there's something that really kills things. Scrum, to me, got killed by people hanging out their Scrum certification next to their Prince2 certification, next to their ITIL certification, not understanding what they were doing, but just following the rules as they were written. So there's no such thing as a DevOps certification, because you can be certified in knowing a tool or something, but how can we certify people that they can collaborate, that they are good human beings? DevOps Days Berlin 2014 figured that out as a joke, and they were basically certifying everybody who came to DevOps Days for being DevOps certified. At DevOps Days Gent, the 5th anniversary, we handed out certificates, and if you can see the small print, it's actually the University of Dev and Ooops. And yes, we gave the first one to Bernd Erk, who did it in Berlin. So there's no such thing as DevOps certification. There's no such thing as an exam you can go to and say, hey, we've done this. You can learn, and you can go to trainings and practice and do things, but it's really hard. And we've seen that from history. Like, ITIL certified people, they might know the book, but they might not understand it. If you think Agile is a procedure where on Monday you do sprint planning, you do sprints every day, you have all the ceremony in place, and you follow it by the rule that you're doing your Agile? Not really. I mean, let's be honest, certifications, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are just milking users for more revenue. There is one exception, however. Look this one up. I got certified 2 weeks ago. This is really the best certification out there. Defining what DevOps is about and trying to help people is really hard, because there's always going to be vendors out there who are going to try to get people into the easy path. And they're going to try to find new ways to explain to people what DevOps is for them. Vendors will try to find something that they can renew. I've seen a large, big, blue-logoed company trying to sell a subscription of DevOps to a financial institution. And they were trying to rebrand the products they had already sold to them 2 years before under a different name. And it's not the only one who did that. So this thing is, it's hard. I think it's also Ken Muggeridge who said, you cannot buy DevOps, but you might have to sell it. You might have to tell people and convince people that this really is about collaboration, that it's not about those tools. And definitely in enterprises, it's really hard. There's people who claim that there's something different between DevOps in the enterprise and the other one. I don't know what the other one is. I mean, the truth is, the more people you have to teach, the more people you have to change their behavior, you're going to get into more friction. You're going to have more people who are going to say, we don't really like this. We've been through 5 transformations before. We've already changed our way of working 4 times. So yes, large organizations are harder to change. It's going to take much longer. There's also much more to change. And at some point, and this is Michael Brunton's-Paul, this quote, at some point in those large organizations, the antibodies kick in. That's when they actually start wanting to change. So what we see in a lot of those large enterprises is that they don't really change. There's small teams in there that change. There's small teams that become much faster, where you can do really awesome things. But the basic fundamentals of those organizations don't really change, because they don't see the need to really change. I stopped doing coaching. I stopped doing transformations in organizations because I just couldn't bring up the energy anymore. I realized that most large organizations aren't even close to what we consider DevOps or even Agile. And their culture is so broken that from the engineers on the floor, they always lie their way one up. Yeah, it's ready for production. Well, we still have about 6 months' work, but if we do that, they're going to kill the project. So the manager one line up is going to say, yeah, it's in production. Yeah, it's live in production. And the CIO gets the message, everything is healthy, everything is running, it's all live up in production. And they announce that to the town hall meeting, and the engineer on the floor says, we still need to do the first commit of this. DockerCon, first one in Amsterdam, there was somebody on stage saying, hey, we use Docker internal. It was a large bank. I went to ask him, can you show me the team that actually uses Docker? It took me 18 months within that organization to find the first team to use the tool. But C-level was going outside and saying, we're using this tool. They weren't. They didn't realize they weren't, but they weren't. And that is what's happening in large organizations. And people are frustrated with that. And that's how we end up having topics like burnout at lots of conferences and how to deal with it. So, if I can give you one big tip, if you want to try to do this, do not call it a DevOps transformation. Do not even call it DevOps. Call it platform engineering for all I care. Call it engineering 2.0. Call it the new SRE team. Because if you call it a DevOps transformation, people are going to assume that they know what DevOps is about. And 10 people in one room, they're all going to have a different idea. They're all going to have a different definition. So what you want to do is say, here we're going to do this engineering, let's skip 4.0, and these are our goals. And as an organization, we want to move forward and try to achieve these goals. And somewhere in the back, there might be some people saying, hey, that's what I heard at DevOps Days or SRECon or whatever, and this is cool, we want to do this. But if you say, hey, we want to do DevOps, they're going to go like, so I read this article, we're going to do this. No. Put up your own charter, put up your own ideas, and see, based on what your organization needs, what you want to do. Yeah. Don't call it the Spotify model. So we're 13 years later. Yes, I'm recycling these slides because, sadly, it still needs to happen. And to me, sadly, this is still where we are. If I'm not running a containerized infrastructure, I have one comment and I figure out if I need to patch for OpenSSL. Tuesday was a public holiday in Belgium, so somebody in our check team just ran that one check. We were fine. And then we needed to start figuring out what the developers had put inside the containers, and we wasted another 4 hours to figure out. Yeah, so who's owning it? Who's collaborating? Here's a Docker image. How did you build this? Why is it 4 gigabytes? How do we monitor this? What do you mean you don't have a health endpoint? You don't have a metrics endpoint? I would love to say that it happened only once, but it happened way too many times. The Docker container restarted, I lost my data. So we moved from here's a tarball to here's a container. Ops problem now. Our industry has been running around in circles for ages. Yes, even the people who went to DevOps Days Amsterdam at some point and got a Lego minifig, they've been running in circles. We see patterns happen over and over again. We go from big monoliths to microservices to things in between, and people who are my age or older will acknowledge that and will figure out, like, I've seen this before, they're going to hit that wall, they're going to make that mistake. And the youngsters are going to go, those old farts again. I'm not going to listen, we know it better. They might hit the wall faster, but they're going to hit the wall. When we were doing large-scale infrastructure deployments with System Imager, we still remember System Imager. That's right, you still need coffee. We were shipping huge images. And the problem with those huge images was that we couldn't modify them fast enough, and we couldn't actually figure out how to make them evolve. So we went from shipping large images to building just enough operating system and then configuring the inside of the image. You know how Docker works with overlay file systems, right? We didn't fix the problem, we recreated it. And I can give you multiple more examples of this. So it's really time for all of us to take a step back and look at what we really want to achieve. These things are not going to help us. I mean, resume-driven development. Where can I get my next gig that is going to pay me just that bit more? Oh, I need to do Kubernetes. Oh, hype-driven development, cargo-driven development. And the rise of YOLO ops. You folks know YOLO ops? It's Silicon Valley-based development. You're not building something for a user. You're building something because your company needs to be sold, and in 2 years you don't care anymore. YOLO. These things are not helping us. The success stories we heard are not always success stories. Change does happen. I worked with a lot of large organizations. I've seen lots of teams completely change the way they're working and become happy. But I've never seen a whole organization change. Is that bad? Not always. It's good. If those people changed, if they're happier, if they're feeling better, it's perfect. But you need to realize that what an executive says on stage might not be the truth. It's going to be a long journey for all of us. Some of you are at the beginning of your career, some of us are somewhere in the middle. And that means that young organizations are also going to grow. They're going to have their growing pains, and things that you assume that are trivial because you've done them for ages. When new people join, they're not going to assume that those are trivial. You need to keep teaching people about the mistakes you made. You need to make sure that they understand why you're doing the things you do, because you prevent things from happening. And you need to embrace new technologies, see where they're applied best. And if you have a good use case for Kube, do it. But not because you heard at a conference that Kubernetes is the solution to all your problems. We need to really teach people to not shoot themselves in the foot. I don't know, I never had it, but feels painful, and you want to prevent those people to have pain. And I think for all of us, our roles are going to be a mix of this. We're going to need to teach people how to collaborate, how to understand technology, while at the same time constantly be learning new technologies and learning new practices. Everybody is going to need to write code. Everybody's going to need to learn to debug a problem. And we all are going to need, again, to build bridges between different types of knowledge. We're going to need to share our experiences and talk about how to do things the right way, being an evangelist for the small victory in your own team, but also for the larger victories. And we're going to need to learn to listen to our peers and figure out where their pains are and how we can help them. And all of that is really what DevOps is about. It really is not about those tools. It really is about changing how you work together. And it is about you, about the people you work with on a daily basis. Thank you.
Okay, we have some questions from the audience. It's all hairy topics, so bear with us. The first one, and I agree with what you said, but someone in the audience does not. Why do we have to stop branching? Because apparently there's a lot of discussion. Not to me, probably not to you that much. But,
so the timer says we have 40 seconds. I need about an hour. But I'm going to have a better idea. Next year, I'm going to send you somebody and invite him to give a talk about it. In continuous delivery, the title of the talk is In Continuous Delivery, Branching is Considered Evil. Look it up. You're hiding inventory, you're basically getting into merge conflicts, and you're shooting yourself in the foot. That's what you're doing. And once you are doing trunk-based, you never want to go back. But I'll hook you up with a great speaker for next year.
All right. Then another one, which, same thing all over again. When to build your own tools versus what's available?
Sorry.
So they are asking about how can you decide when to build your own tools versus grab something that's available and potentially improving it?
So there's when to build your own tools, when to grab something that's available. The first thing already to me is like there's so many awesome open source tools out there. That should be your foundation. That should be your baseline. You're going to do things in your organization that might not be a perfect fit, and you're going to need to build the glue to do something. But you probably do not need to build a whole new tool. You might want to have some tool that gathers some information from third-party systems, from your project management teams, things like that. But look at what is around in open source, build on top of that, and then maybe figure out where to fill the gaps with some duct tape, with some glue.
So someone is doing kind of the analogy that, like, is DevOps something like Agile to bring together devs and ops, in a way?
I don't know what... I've read about Agile, but it's ages ago, so I cannot really comment on the exact details, but I think John Willis has a talk about that topic, and I think the answer is yes, but he's probably has a better answer.
Okay. And the final question, because we are running out of time, is like, someone who is probably a team lead, if doing good DevOps is a culture problem, how can I tell that to my team so that they start focusing on culture and not, potentially writing pristine YAML or things like that? Some advice. It's some advice to some team lead that is trying to tell their team, like, so if good DevOps is a culture problem, what do I tell my team so that they realize it's about culture and not tooling? Or if you can bring some advice, of course, because it's always tricky.
The first problem is, does the team realize what the problem is? Do they feel pain? Is it just you, or does the whole team feel pain? And once you realize the whole team feels the pain, you'll be able to pinpoint at least where some of the pain is coming from. If it's just you who doesn't fit within the team, within the organization, I think there is lots of people out there hiring. But once people as a team figure out that there is a problem, they'll realize it's not the tooling. It typically is a human problem. It is about communication. It is about interactions.
All right, thanks for answering the questions. And again, big round of applause for Kris, who kindly came here today.
Thank you.
Thanks for a great keynote.